In August 1974, Elvis Presley was performing to a packed Vegas crowd when he suddenly stopped mid-song, walked off the stage, and knelt down in front of a dying fan in a wheelchair, leaving 2,000 people in complete silence. What happened in those next few moments wasn't just captured on film, it changed everyone who witnessed it forever. But what did Elvis whisper to that man that made grown adults break down crying? The International Hotel's showroom thrummed with electric anticipation on that sweltering August night in 1974. The capacity crowd pressed against red velvet seats, their conversations creating a symphony of excitement that echoed off the gold-leafed walls. Ice clinked in cocktail glasses, while cigarette smoke drifted lazily through the amber theatrical illumination, creating an almost ethereal haze that seemed to separate the audience from the empty stage they all stared at with hungry eyes. Women in sequined evening gowns adjusted their jewelry nervously, while men in expensive suits checked their watches, all united in their breathless anticipation for the moment when the king would grace them with his presence. Backstage, Elvis Presley stood before a mirror framed by harsh fluorescent bulbs, adjusting the collar of his white jumpsuit studded with crystalline embellishments that caught the light like fallen stars. Sweat had already begun to bead along his hairline, despite the air conditioning that hummed relentlessly through the venue. His hands trembled slightly, whether from nerves, exhaustion, or something else entirely. Even he couldn't say. The familiar pre-show ritual felt different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the very air carried the weight of unspoken expectations that pressed down on his shoulders like invisible chains. Colonel Parker paced behind him, cigar smoke trailing from his lips as he rattled off numbers and statistics that should have thrilled any performer. Sold out for the 15th consecutive night. Record merchandise sales. Standing ovations before Elvis even appeared. Television cameras positioned to capture every moment for posterity. But the king barely heard the words, his attention drawn instead to the distant rumble of the crowd. Beyond the curtain, a sound that once electrified him, but now felt like an ocean wave, threatening to crash down and sweep him away into oblivion. The orchestra began their opening flourishes, violins soaring above the steady pulse of drums that seemed to match the rhythm of Elvis's own heartbeat. In the wings, dancers in sequined costumes stretched and prepared, their excited chatter mixing with the technical crew's last-minute adjustments to lights and sound equipment. Everything moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each person knowing their role in the spectacle about to unfold. Backup singers warmed up their voices with scales that drifted through the backstage area like musical prayers, while guitar technicians made final tuning adjustments that would ensure every note rang perfect and true. Yet something felt different in the air tonight, a tension that crackled like electricity before a thunderstorm. Elvis could sense it in the way his musicians exchanged glances, in the unusual restlessness of the audience, in the very atmosphere that seemed to pulse with anticipation for something beyond the usual performance. The veteran entertainer had learned to trust these instincts over the years, this ability to read a room before he even set foot on stage. Tonight carried the weight of destiny, though he couldn't yet understand what form that destiny would take. As the opening chords of his entrance music began to build, Elvis took one final look at himself in the mirror, knowing that something extraordinary awaited him beyond that curtain. The curtain rose, and destiny stepped into the light. The stage blazed with illumination as Elvis strode across it, cape flowing behind him like liquid starlight, but the familiar surge of adrenaline felt muted tonight. His smile, though practiced and dazzling, didn't quite reach his eyes as he launched into CC Rider, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion that no amount of stage makeup could conceal. The crowd erupted in their typical frenzy, women screaming his name and reaching toward the stage with desperate fingers, but their adoration felt distant, filtered through the pharmaceutical fog that had become his constant companion in recent months. Between songs, Elvis wiped his brow with a silk scarf, his movements slower than usual, each gesture requiring more effort than it once had. The divorce papers sat unsigned on his Graceland desk. Priscilla's absence from the audience, a glaring reminder of how his personal life crumbled, while his professional obligations marched relentlessly forward. Every night brought another crowd, another performance, another expectation to be the king they all remembered from his early days, when music flowed from him like pure lightning. His band watched him carefully. These musicians who had become his brothers over countless nights in smoky venues and glittering showrooms. They could read the subtle signs, the way he favored his left leg, the slight delay before hitting certain high notes, the moments when his eyes seemed to search the crowd for something he couldn't quite name. The doctor prescribed remedies that helped him sleep, also helped him forget. But they couldn't erase the loneliness that followed him even into rooms filled with thousands of adoring fans. The white fabric of his jumpsuit, with gold lame trim, clung to skin damp with perspiration as he moved through his repertoire. Each song, a familiar friend that had carried him through decades of triumph and heartbreak. "Love Me Tender" rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but tonight the words felt hollow, empty vessels carrying memories of a simpler time, when love seemed possible and fame hadn't yet built walls around his heart. The audience swayed along, lost in their own memories of first dances and stolen kisses. While Elvis performed on autopilot, his body going through motions his soul had temporarily abandoned. As he transitioned into "Can't Help Falling in Love," Elvis's gaze wandered across the sea of faces, searching for something real among the sea of worship and expectation. The front rows blurred together, wealthy tourists, clutching cameras, high rollers with their perfectly coiffed wives, industry executives calculating profits from his sweat and sorrow. His voice carried the melody flawlessly, muscle memory guiding him through verses and choruses, while his mind drifted to quieter moments, to the simple human connections that fame had slowly stripped away. But tonight, that search would end in ways he never could have imagined. Then a presence in the crowd caught his eye. A stillness among the motion, an energy that seemed to pulse with different intensity than the surrounding chaos. His voice continued the familiar lyrics, but his attention sharpened, focusing on a figure in the front row that made his breath catch in his throat, and his carefully constructed performance begin to crumble. The melody of "Can't Help Falling in Love" died on Elvis's lips as his eyes locked onto the man in the wheelchair, positioned directly in front of the stage. Time seemed to fracture, the usual flow of performance grinding to a halt as the king processed what he was seeing. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, but disease had carved deep lines into his face and stolen the color from his skin, leaving behind a translucent pallor that spoke of hospitals and sleepless nights. His wife stood beside the wheelchair, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held a handmade sign that read in careful script, "Last wish to meet Elvis." The orchestra continued for several beats before the conductor noticed Elvis had stopped singing entirely. One by one, the instruments fell silent, first the guitars, then the drums, until even the background singers' voices faded into confused whispers. The packed audience sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether this pause was part of the show or something else entirely. The silence stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the distant clatter of slot machines from the casino beyond. Elvis stood motionless at center stage, his cape settling around him as he stared down at the dying man, whose eyes burned with an intensity that cut through the performance beams and chemical haze. In those eyes, Elvis saw something he'd forgotten existed: raw, unfiltered human need, stripped of pretense or ulterior motive. This wasn't a fan seeking an autograph or a photograph to sell. This wasn't someone trying to get close to celebrity for their own gain. This was a soul reaching across the divide between performer and audience, between the healthy and the dying, between the king and the common man. Security guards tensed at the edge of the stage, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented break in protocol. Colonel Parker emerged from the wings, his face flushed with confusion and growing concern as he watched his most valuable asset stand frozen like a statue before countless paying customers. For a moment that stretched like eternity, performer and audience existed in perfect suspension. The showroom had transformed from a place of entertainment into something approaching a church, heavy with unspoken prayers and desperate hope. Without warning, Elvis stepped forward and began descending the stairs that led down into the audience. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he navigated past startled guests who couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing each step as the king of rock and roll left his throne and walked among his subjects. The dying man's wife covered her mouth with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the reality of her husband's final wish coming true in ways she'd never dared imagine. Elvis approached the wheelchair with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching an altar. The showroom held its collective breath as he knelt down beside the man, bringing himself to eye level with someone the world would forget, but who had somehow commanded the attention of the most famous entertainer on earth. In that moment, the shimmering adornments meant nothing. The sold-out crowd meant nothing. The contracts and obligations and endless demands of fame all dissolved, leaving only two human beings sharing a moment of connection that transcended every boundary that usually separated them. Elvis reached out and gently took the dying man's hands in his own, surprised by how fragile they felt, paper-thin skin over brittle bones that seemed to tremble with each labored breath. The man's eyes widened with disbelief, tears spilling down his hollow cheeks as he whispered something barely audible. Elvis leaned closer, his famous face inches from someone whose name would never appear in lights, whose story would never make headlines, but whose humanity blazed brighter than any spotlight. "What's your name?" Elvis asked softly, his voice carrying none of the theatrical projection that usually filled concert halls. The intimacy of the moment seemed to expand outward, touching every person in the showroom who strained to witness this unprecedented display of grace. The man's wife sobbed quietly, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder as she watched the impossible unfold before her eyes. Around them, hardened casino workers and jaded entertainment industry veterans found themselves blinking back tears they hadn't expected to shed. The conversation between Elvis and the dying fan continued in hushed tones, words meant only for each other, but somehow blessing everyone present. Elvis listened with the attention he usually reserved for his closest confidants, nodding as the man shared whatever final thoughts had brought him to this moment. The king's own eyes began to glisten as he absorbed the weight of someone else's mortality, the reminder that fame and fortune offered no protection against life's ultimate equalizer. Without hesitation, Elvis reached up and unwound his signature accessory from around his neck, the same treasured keepsake he'd worn for countless performances, now damp with his own sweat and carrying the scent of performance and dreams. He placed it gently around the dying man's shoulders, like a ceremonial robe, transforming a simple piece of fabric into something approaching the sacred. The gesture rippled through the audience like electricity, every soul in attendance witnessing generosity that couldn't be bought or sold or captured adequately by any camera. Elvis remained kneeling for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, his hand resting on the man's arm as they shared words that would remain private forever. When he finally stood, his movements were those of someone transformed by encounter, someone who had remembered what mattered beneath all the glitter and noise. He kissed the man's forehead with the tenderness of a father blessing a child, then turned to embrace the sobbing wife, whispering something that made her nod through her tears. The walk back to the stage felt different from his descent into the audience. Elvis climbed those stairs not as the king returning to his throne, but as a man who had just been reminded of his own humanity by someone who had nothing left to lose or gain. The crowd erupted in applause that had nothing to do with entertainment, and everything to do with witnessing compassion in its purest form. As Elvis picked up the microphone and prepared to continue the show, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally shifted. He had stepped outside the carefully constructed persona of stardom and revealed something real beneath the surface, an experience that would echo in the memories of everyone present long after the last note faded and the lights dimmed. In choosing to honor one dying man's wish, Elvis had reminded them all, and perhaps himself, what it meant to be fully, beautifully human.